I think today is just different shades of gray. Can playing a chess game with 1,000 different people at the same time. I think fraud prevention has changed tremendously. Every time I make a move, they make a move. That's what got me hooked. This is incredibly difficult and that has a lot of consequences for the business. I'm funding fraud workaholic. And you have to be a real Swiss Army knife to be good at the job. If I had to be a teacher, my first test would be...
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the new episode of the podcast A Journey into Fraud Prevention. I'm your host Ivan, and today we have a chat with Boris Montin, who lives in sunny Barcelona and works in delivery company Glovo as a global head of risk, identity strategy and analytics. For our Spanish listeners, buenos días, ¿qué tal? We begin our episode. Поехали! Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. Hello Boris, thank you for joining us for the next episode. To follow our previous episodes, let me ask our first questions. I'm usually ask the same questions everyone. It's going to be mandatory for everyone who participates in this podcast. The question is fraud prevention. What is fraud prevention for you?
Thank you, Ivan, for having me today. I'm really excited to be here, and this is a really interesting podcast. I don't think we have a lot of podcasts around fraud, so I think it's great that you're spearheading this initiative. It's a good question you ask. I think fraud prevention really depends on the business, the type of business you're in, the type of company you're in, and the type of market you're in. And over the past few years, I think fraud prevention has changed tremendously. And when you look at the world before the pandemic, for me in my business, which was food delivery and mobility, it was a time of VC, was a time of venture where we had unlimited access to capital. And then during the pandemic, it was a time of explosion of growth where we were focusing heavily on top line. And now with the market condition and inflation coming in, it's a time where everyone has to be profitable and we have to signal profitability to investors. And so I think prevention has been quite different across those three stages. And if you had asked me this question a year ago, I would have given you different answers. Even 2 years ago, I would have given you very different answers. But from my perspective today, I look at it from a financial perspective and from a product perspective. Of course, in fraud prevention, you have your typical chargebacks. You have your typical financial fraud losses that comes from bad actors. All of it, in terms of financial losses, comes from your checkout and essentially from consumers trying to purchase your product. But I think over the past couple of years, we've learned to be able to extend the reach and the leadership of fraud prevention team. And today, fraud prevention is a lot more complex. And we touch areas such as refunds or returns, incentives. And at the same time, I think because fraud experts today have a lot of understanding of friction, have a lot of understanding of mathematics, have a lot of understandings between the trade-off of growth and profitability, they can also guide other teams in your business to be able to make rational decision on investments. So for me, fraud prevention is about ensuring safe money movement for your business. And at the same time, we have a duty of thought leadership.
Thank you for your answer. And I'm hearing from my previous guest that the COVID really affects on all types of business. And I believe your business is really a great example that like COVID changed the understanding of the fraud prevention. And as you mentioned, if I ask you the same questions 2 years ago, or how many, like 3 years ago, before the COVID start, it's going to be something different. But how different it's gonna be if it's no like COVID happens?
Absolutely. I think it was a combination of COVID, and at the same time, it was a time where everyone was focused on top line. Everyone was focused on the number of new customers you had, on the total number of orders you had. And I think we had at the time very little question on profitability. And when COVID first hit, the role of the fraud team was to support growth as much as we could by trying to optimize friction as much as we could. But today, if there was another wave of COVID or another massive event like this, I think the role would be flipped, and I think we would be extremely more careful about how and who do we allow on our platform and who do we make business with. So I think today would be very different than the previous waves.
I hope nothing like that arrive in near future. I believe it's enough. It's
Of
enough.
course. Yeah.
It is enough. Things happens around the world. I, I'm not ready for another for another layer of the problems around the world. And how long have you been in the fraud prevention in the general?
I think I stumbled upon fraud prevention, I think 6 to 7 years ago. I first picked up the fraud hat a couple years ago when I was working at Uber, and today I still have it in my current job at Glovo. It's been quite a very interesting journey. I think if I look at how we used to do things, in my first job in fraud, it used to be very binary, right? We used to do things, is this fraud or is this not fraud? And then we would play whack-a-mole to an extent with the fraudulent actors. Today, I think fraud has evolved quite a lot. We are a lot more nuanced. We think about the customer journey a lot more. We think about false positive a lot more. And we really trying to optimize for that. Where like a couple of years ago, it was very black and white. I think today it's just different shades of gray. And you try to apply different fraud solution according to the different profile of your bad actors. Sometimes it's just people that are opportunistic. Sometimes these are really bad actors. And I think fraud is usually happen because there's an opportunity for someone to abuse the system, right? In my case, they would try to have a free lunch. Obviously, this is something very tempting that we can all relate to. But my goal here in fraud over the past 7 years is simply to try to remove this arbitrage and to make it more difficult for the bad actors. So overall, 7 years going strong and quite interesting in that world.
What was the first action that's actually motivate you to join this fraud prevention path? Like 7 years ago, what you I know read, maybe you see a sign somewhere. What is the main contribute that's put you in the fraud prevention?
Absolutely. I think this is a very personal experience, but I used to work at a bank. I used to work as a financial analyst for a bank. Um, and that bank was located in one of the countries on the west coast of Africa. And when I was working in a bank, I saw, unfortunately, quite a bit of embezzlement. And that really sparked my interest to work on fraud, to understand a bit more how it happened and to try to prevent it. So it came from real life example, and I've ever since tried to understand a bit more and try to combat it.
Such a great story. It is kind of from the books of old books from I don't know New York police, New York, who just like start to investigate. Someone stole his newspaper and afterwards decided to join police and prevent it.
Exactly, exactly.
And when you joined fraud prevention like 7 years ago, was your first impression of this career path? Do you find it strange, or maybe you find it super easy? Or was like feeling?
I think fraud prevention for me feels the same as 7 years ago. I feel like I'm playing a chess game with 1,000 different people at the same time. Every time I make a move, they make a move. If I create something, they will adapt around it and they will find a way around it. I remember very clearly in my first fraud prevention role, where in my first couple of months, I was working on fixing a loophole around fraud. And I remember very clearly being able to fix that loophole, being able to apply a patch. And 1 hour after I applied that patch, I was already seeing fraudster trying to abuse the same loophole, but they discovered a new loophole around it. And I've worked weeks and weeks for my patch to be solved in a single hour. And I was very frustrated at that time, but also very excited because for me, it meant that the game was on and that they made the move, I make the move, and we were on to the next stage. So it was definitely super interesting, and that what got me hooked for the rest of the 7 years. And to go to your second question, it's definitely a very unique world because to be really good at fraud prevention, you need to have a lot of data. And sometimes you have to look at the needle in the haystack. while some other team focus on a single data, I think fraud, you have to look at contextual clues. So you have to be really a private detective to be able to put everything into context to be able to find the fraud.
Have a lot of the data to prevent something. I believe it is kind of new native way to like fraud fighters speaking with the business, because it's a lot of examples that right now exist on the market when people say, if you give me more information, I'll definitely find something and start to save you money. And we can see it is apply everywhere, even what you mentioned here, that once we have more information, we are able to find something more uniqueable, be like detective rather than someone who just like looking on strange happens and clicks the red button and kill everyone in that way.
Exactly. I think the role of the team is really to provide an understanding of the behaviors, and then we can define what is the best action to solve that behavior. Sometimes it's just education. Sometimes people are just trying to be opportunistic. I think we have to have measured answer. We can't go all out with the ban hammer for every condition.
You know, it is one question that I just realized I never asked it in the previous episode, but really want to hear your um, story here, or maybe some of your assumption about this question. I know you work in different countries with different people with different nationalities, and is it different kind of way how the people work in the different countries? So, for example, someone from the Africa looking on the same case with someone from Spain, they come up with different conclusion.
From a fraud point of view, if we are talking about the bad actors or the malicious actors that are trying to generate profit are very different on a regional basis. In the Northern Europe and in the US, it's a lot of credit card fraud. If you look at in the dark web, a lot of the solutions provided, for instance, by the Russian actors are often tools, often automated script, often bots to be able to crack the defense of the different businesses. These are tools that are purely automated, where you have very little interaction and contact. If you look at the Chinese underground versus if you look at the Spanish underground, these are very different types of profiles, very different types of solutions. And I think a lot of the time they would try, for instance, in the Spanish underground to sell you tutorial on how to do fraud. So you would have a guide, a step-by-step guide on how to do it. If you think about a fraud in China, it would be agent services. So a middle ground trying to tell you this, trying to sell you the service at a discount price. So from a fraud point of view, it's very different. From an investigation point of view, as you mentioned, it's also quite different. I think people have different inclination. Oftentimes, for a lot of companies, Africa was an expansion market that was heavily incentivized with a lot of coupons, a lot of promos, a lot of benefits. And so a lot of the time, African sort of investigation would focus on that those incentives. Versus in the US, they would look at refunds. Versus in France, for instance, they would look at delivery time and some other things. So everyone has their own sort of specific regional trends and biases.
Quite interesting. I never thought about it in a general way when I had the several interviews with the people. I never thought they thinking about specific cases, like from the different perspective, more regional perspective. But I now I'm just recall that some replies from the people when I asked them the questions, what type of fraud we might have in the platform, they usually like answer from the country perspective. Quite interesting knowledge. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Absolutely.
And what's the hardest things when you work in a fraud prevention industry as a fraud fighter?
I think the hardest thing for me, I can think of two things top of mind. I think one is defining fraud. What is fraud? What does it mean to commit fraud for you, for the users, and for everyone? I think sometimes fraud is obvious. When we think about chargeback, it's quite easy to know when there's a chargeback because we look at money coming in and out of the account and we see that finally the user has not paid for the services. And that's very easy to track financially. But there are other type of fraud that are quite gray, that are quite blurry, that we don't really know what's happening. If, for instance, you decide to use two discount code or three discount code that are supposed to be unique and redeemable once, is this fraud? Is this you being opportunistic? Or let's say that you order something from Amazon, you order a book, and you complain to the support that the book never arrived. At the end of the day, it's very difficult for everyone in the risk department to know if you have received the order or not. And so we have to make a number of assumptions that are obviously backed with data and with rationale, with principles. But this is difficult to really explain, right? What is fraud? Where do you draw the limit? What is an operation issue versus what is a financial loss? This is incredibly difficult, and that has a lot of consequences for the business. So this is something that we continue to struggle with, and I've always had the challenge in my career, and I continue to have the challenge. And I suspect that as we expand into new fraud vertical, as we expand to new businesses, we will likely to have a same challenge. If I were to ask what is fraud and what is difficult about fraud across 100 experts, I'm sure I will have different answers. That's one thing, and that brings me to the second point, which is how do you explain fraud to someone that is not in the fraud domain? And obviously, when you're part of a business, you have to be able to explain fraud to your leadership, to your management team, and you have to tell them why this is important that we tackle fraud in your business. And you have to tell them how do you make decisions based on fraud. And this is also not easy, right? Because fraud can be, as I mentioned, subjective. And also because fraud relies on a lot of data, a lot of contextual information. And it's also a technical world. It's not always straightforward to explain. And then if you add on top, machine learning models and things like that, this makes this explanation even more difficult. And so I continuously struggle to explain what is risk, what is fraud, and how we think about it from a business standpoint. So this is for me big challenges in fraud.
When I used to work in one of my past companies, our COO, I know for some reason he had 5 different cards, and all of them from different countries. And every time we block his transaction, and every time he messaged me and asked why we always block his transaction, and I explained him over and over again, it is not right when you try to using 5 different cards in a short period of time, and all of them from different countries. It looks suspicious. Please stop doing it. And every time he tested how our system works, and one day I remember all his transaction came through without any problems, and he just started escalating us that something broke because system supposed to be block him. But we, to prevent all these questions, say we are doing the whitelist, so it's not gonna be our problem anymore, and you not screw up all our metrics over and over again.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is why it's difficult to explain. And also, you always have, when you deal with fraud, you always have false positives, right? And you need to be comfortable to have a small percentage of false positive in your business. And you will always have anecdotes of, hey, I've been blocked, or I had issue with your platform. Can you please help me out? And how to deal with those is also incredibly difficult because is it a signal that your system is not well tuned? Or is this noise and this is just the reality of having a false positive? Or is this just a bad actor claiming to be a false positive? It's not easy.
Yeah, hardest word is a false positive, because every time when you hear some stories about false positive, you just I can't believe it. I feel something not right here. If I click the button to approve it, I might have some troubles very soon, but most of the times it is legit. Have you ever been victim of fraud?
Yes, actually, very recently, unfortunately. About 2 weeks ago, I was looking at my credit card statement and I found a couple of odd charges where I had some charges for Zoom in Singaporean dollar and in Japanese yen. Obviously, I have a corporate Zoom account and I don't use Zoom in Japan or Singapore. And so I had to call my bank and I had to find for a chargeback and I had to spend a couple of minutes on the phone trying to explain that, hey, I was not the one purchasing those services. Now, the fun fact is when I saw those charges, my first reaction was, "Oh, okay, someone is using my credit card, but at least they're using services to optimize their fraud efficiency. They are using Zoom to be able to optimize their fraud services. I'm dealing with business minded people and I'm not funded any extravagant vacation. I'm funding fraud workaholic, which was, I guess, a bit of silver lining. That was my first reaction to it.
I believe you're fortunate that they're using for Zoom because it remind me one of the article I know 5 or 6 years ago when it like divorce happens because wife checking the settlements of the family card and they realize that it some charges in a very like 5-star hotel in Malibu and they never been for vacation for a long period of time, so it's probably something happens there. It was a big fight and divorce at the end. But behind it was like card compromise and someone just bought the right vacation.
Ouch.
Bought the right vacation.
Yeah. That can be tricky, huh? And that can be a very difficult situation to explain.
So let's say you're tired of fraud prevention. After 7 years or maybe after 10 years, you just like, I don't like these rules. Machine learning explain over and over again to businesses. Fraud is bad and we need more things to prevent it. Where are you going? Which industry you find very like good right now to join? Or maybe you have some dream idea and you start to, I don't know, prepare plans to deliver to moon and expand it there, something like that.
I think for me, I always found fraud prevention to be a very good school of life because it teaches you many things. It teaches you problem solving, prioritization, and communication at the same time. You have to be a real Swiss Army knife to be good at the job. And so I think once you've been in fraud prevention, you can work in a few different areas. For me, I've always been fascinated by a few things. One of them is supporting early stages startup, which is also something I'm doing in my spare time. And maybe in a couple of years, this is something that I would want to do full time. Otherwise, also maybe explore opening a consulting business for risk since I have the chance to be part of a niche domain. And if else fail, maybe open a bookstore. That would be fun as well.
I hope you're gonna stay in fraud prevention path as long as this because we need all fraud fighters to preventing abusing around the world, and we can't lose the professional like you from this path. But if you're feeling that one day you want to, I know, go to Bali and start a surfing school, no one just gonna stop you. It sounds amazing. And I already like ask a lot of the people about how they join fraud prevention, and so far I didn't hear that we have some institution or specific degree of the fraud prevention. But the question is, do we need this fraud institution or degree to be part of fraud prevention, or we okay in the way how it works?
I think this is such an interesting question. To what extent fraud is an open secret versus a black box? Oftentimes we think about fraud prevention as a black box, and I think we can use being a bit more open. I don't think that you need to have necessarily a lot of knowledge to be able to enter the fraud prevention world. I think as long as you're good with mathematics, problem solving, and you have resilience, because you need to keep fighting those good fights, as long as you have those three qualities, you would excel at it. I think there are a lot of groups out there that are trying to organize the fraud prevention world. You have the Merchant Risk Council as an example, and other organisms that are trying to organize the fraud prevention space. But at the same time, my opinion is that fraud prevention, if this is done well, is an incredible competitive advantage that you have over other businesses. And I think if this is done well, you will be a lot more efficient with your fund and you will have a better customer experience overall. So on the one hand, I want to tell you that this is something that would be great if we open to the world and if we have, schools or if we have diplomas and if we have institutions. On the other hand, there's benefit to have it as a secret sauce. So it really depends, I suppose.
And quick follow-up questions. If they open a university tomorrow, would you consider to join as a professor there?
That would be fun. My first test would be if I had to be a teacher, my first test would be a fraud case and making them commit fraud in the first hand. That would be a fun test to do.
I have probably last question. We hear a lot about fraud prevention, how you join this career path, and but in general, for someone who listens to this podcast, would you recommend fraud prevention as career path, or maybe for someone who considering to jump from invest banking or from consulting to join fraud prevention, or maybe for someone who just get degree and considering to first position, what gonna be advice for these people?
I think I would recommend them, but I think it also depends on the job profile. It depends on the experience. It depends what they want to get out of the job. If they want to get something that is intellectually challenging, I would recommend it. I think for position like analyst or product position or engineering position, I would probably recommend them to have a couple of experiences first, because I think it's important that you develop first your skills like business acumen or problem solving. I think fraud prevention requires a bit of first knowledge, I would say basic knowledge to be able to excel at game. Um, that being said, obviously, if you want to apply for other positions like investigation teams or something like that, then absolutely, I think as a first job, this is perfectly fine. I think fraud prevention offers a lot of challenges, a lot of learning opportunities for both your hard skill, which would be your technical analysis of problems, and your soft skill, which is explaining the set of problem that you have to your teams, to your leaderships, and to your customers. So I think it offers both good learnings professionally and also good environment, I would say, because everyone is on the same boat here.
And additionally, I added for that's fun when you're working with against fraudsters, it's good karma for you for your future. Don't forget about it. It's very important there.
That's clear. But I think to be good at fraud, you have to have the mind of a fraudster, which can be also tricky for the karma, because you have to think like one to be one.
Okay, I decline my last advice. Not join fraud prevention. It's bad for karma. It's good and bad for karma. So at the end, it's going to be neutral. You're not getting more and getting less. It's going to be zero at the end. So it's not spiritual. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us today. I have a lot of great information and I learned so much, and all the valuable things is very useful for me. And I believe it's going to be useful for our listeners who just turned in and completed this episode.
Thanks a lot for having me today, Ivan. I'm really looking forward to this podcast.
And for our listeners, please don't forget to follow up the podcast and share with your friends. It is really mean a lot for me and for everyone who just working for prevention, because we try to share our knowledge and some of idea for people who want to join in fraud prevention in general. So I'm gonna call it my favorite word that I'm using on every podcast at the end, and I say word cut.